Journeys across the Indus. Alexander Burnes's 1832. Passage from Attock to Peshawar in historical context and echoes in the present. The Afghans are a people who have never bowed to conqueror or king without extracting, in the fullness of time, their own price. Olaf Caroe, The Pathans, 1958. 1. Crossing the frontier, Attock, the Indus and Khattak lands. We were met by the Afghans with Wassalam alaikum, and after the usual exchange of courtesies, the escort of the Sikhs wheeled about and retired, leaving us to the hospitality of our new hosts. Alexander Burnes travels into Bokhara, Volume 1, 1834. There is a moment in Alexander Burnes's travels into Bokhara, 1834, that crystallises something essential about the frontier between Punjab and the Pashtun. Lands, a frontier that has shifted in name and sovereignty many times, but whose underlying grammar of encounter has changed far less than we might suppose. Burnes describes the handover at the Sikh-Afghan boundary, the Sikh escort wheeling away at its limits some 3 miles beyond the Indus at Attock, the Afghan Khattaks advancing to receive the British party with an Islamic salutation. Neither side approaches the other's ground. The courtesy is formal, the distance deliberate. Something passes in that interval authority, responsibility, the tacit acknowledgement that one world has ended and another begun, that no bridge or administrative boundary has ever fully dissolved. Burnes crossed the Indus at Attock in 1832, when Peshawar was held, unhappily and under tribute, by the Barakzai Sardar Sultan Muhammad Khan, while Maharaja Ranjit Singh's armies stood barely a march away. The Khattak tribesmen who received him at Akora, a village that Burnes found near deserted, its population driven off by repeated Sikh inroads, were, in his estimation, a lawless race, a judgment that tells us more about the anxieties of a company servant on a covert mission than it does about the Khattaks themselves. The Khattaks were, and remain, among the most distinctively organised of the Pashtun tribes, soldiers by tradition, poets by temperament. Khushal Khan Khattak, the 17th century warrior poet, is their most celebrated son, and occupants of a corridor that every power seeking to master the subcontinent has had to cross or placate. That corridor today runs through Attock district in Punjab province and into Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. The Indus still moves here with the authority Burnes admired, swollen in summer from Himalayan snowmelt, grey-green and muscular at the point where it receives the Kabul River. Attock Fort, a Mughal structure completed under Akbar in 1583 and reinforced by every subsequent ruler, including the British, still commands the crossing from its basalt promontory. The great cantilever bridge built by the British in 1883, the Attock Bridge, carries road and rail on 2 decks, a monument to imperial logistics that Burnes would have found incomprehensible and, perhaps, alarming. On both banks, Pashtun settlements persist, Khattak villages in the uplands, Niazi communities along the river terraces, absorbed into Punjab province administratively, but maintaining tribal identities that predate the Mughal Empire. The animosity Burnes witnessed between Sikh and Afghan visceral, expressed in bleaching bones across the plains of Nowshera, has dissolved, as profound enmities sometimes do, into something closer to a layered coexistence. The Second Anglo-Sikh War of 1848–49 brought Peshawar under British authority and removed the Sikh military presence from the frontier. What followed was not reconciliation exactly, but a kind of administrative amnesia, in which the British enrolled both Sikhs and Pashtuns into the regimental structures of the Indian Army, and encouraged each to understand their martial virtues as complementary rather than opposed. Khattaks served in units like the 25th Punjabis. Their reputations as soldiers were calibrated and deployed. Nowshera, whose plains had run with blood in 1823 when Ranjit Singh's general, Mahan Singh, crushed the Afghan coalition of Azim Khan and the Yusufzai Lashkar, became a garrison town and remains one today, housing Pakistan Army formations and an ordnance factory that makes it one of the most militarized towns in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. Burns passed through these battlefields with the eye of a man trained to read terrain for strategic value. He noted where 8,000 Sikhs had held at Sidhu. He recorded the site of Nowshera, with the bones of the fallen still visible. To travel the same road today, the N5 National Highway running from Rawalpindi through Attock, Akora Khattak, Nowshera, and into Peshawar, is to traverse a landscape in which the sediment of those engagements lies just beneath the surface of the ordinary. A petrol station where a cavalry position once stood, a bazaar grown over a former cantonment, the river crossing where armies once queued to decide the fate of empires. 2. The romance of the frontier, Caroe, Mayne, Kipling, and the literary tradition. The Pathan is not a romantic figure in the Victorian sense. He is something more uncomfortable, a man who takes his own laws seriously. Olaf Caroe, The Pathans, 1958. There exists a substantial literary tradition in which the Pashtun frontier is encountered not merely as a geopolitical problem, but as a landscape of the imagination, a place where the ordinary rules of imperial experience seem to loosen, and something older and more demanding asserts itself. Kipling felt it. So did Peter Mayne. So, in a more systematic and scholarly register, did Olaf Caroe. What these writers share is less a coherent political position than a quality of attention, a sense that the Pashtun lands require from their visitors a more total engagement than most colonial encounter demands. Burns, though he predates the high Victorian romanticism of the frontier, belongs in this tradition. His ethnographic curiosity, his willingness to travel in disguise, his genuine interest in the people who fed and housed and outwitted him. These are the instincts of a man who understood, at some level, that he was not merely passing through a territory, but entering a civilization. Kipling's Pashtun figures, Mahbub Ali in Kim, the various Afridis and Khyberis who move through his stories, are romanticized, certainly, but not falsified in any simple sense. Kipling understood that Pashtunwali, the tribal code of honor, hospitality, and revenge that structures Pashtun social life, was not a picturesque curiosity, but a functioning legal and ethical system of considerable antiquity and sophistication. His characters honor Melmastia, hospitality, and Badal, revenge, because Kipling had absorbed enough of the frontier's atmosphere to understand that these were not interchangeable impulses, but complementary obligations that a man who offered bread and salt was bound by something as serious as any treaty. Peter Mayne's The Narrow Smile, 1955, an account of a year spent in Peshawar in the early 1950s, captures a transitional moment, the frontier under Pakistani sovereignty, the Sardari system giving way to administrative modernity, the old bazaar economy beginning to feel the pressures of post-partition migration and Cold War geopolitics. Mayne's Peshawar is a city in which the past is not merely remembered but physically inhabited. Mughal caravanserai converted into warehouses, Sikh-era havelis housing extended Pashtun families, British cantonment bungalows occupied by Pakistani officers who had inherited both the buildings and, imperfectly, the institutional cultures of their predecessors. What strikes the reader of Mayne alongside Burns is how persistent certain social textures prove, the centrality of the hudra, men's guest house, as the site of political conversation, the quail fighting as a medium of sociability among men who otherwise have little reason to sit together, the formal hospitality that imposes obligations on host and guest simultaneously. Olaf Caroe's The Pathans, 1958, is the most ambitious attempt to synthesize this tradition into a single historical account. Caroe, who had served as governor of the Northwest Frontier Province and knew the region with an intimacy that few British administrators achieved, wrote with the authority of long experience and the melancholy of a man describing a world he knew was passing. His chapter on Peshawar takes up many of the same threads that Burns had handled a century and a quarter earlier: the tribalism, the hospitality, the complex layering of Pashtun identity over earlier populations, the peculiar position of Peshawar as a city that has always been at once Pashtun in its dominant culture and cosmopolitan in its actual composition. Caroe understood, as Burns had intuited, that the romance of the frontier is not a European projection onto a passive landscape. It arises, at least in part, from the Pashtuns' own self-understanding, their pride in a code of conduct that they regard as both ancient and morally serious, their consciousness of having been, across many centuries, the pivot on which the fate of empires turned. For a writer approaching this material from within, as someone who has grown up in the shadow of these hills, who has read Caroe and Mayne and encountered the intellectual tradition they represent, the romance is neither uncritical nor external. It is the romance of recognition, the sense that the landscape and its people, for all their transformation under British administration, Pakistani statehood, and the convulsions of jihad and insurgency, have preserved something in their social texture that connects them to the world Burns described. The Khattak who welcomed Burns at Akora and the Khattak soldier serving in the Pakistan Army today are not, of course, the same man, but they share a lineage of obligation to the guest, to the tribe, to a code that precedes and survives the states that have claimed jurisdiction over them. 3. Peshawar: hospitality, power, and the persistence of the Sardari world. Sultan Muhammad Khan came out to meet us in person, a distinction rarely paid to travellers in this country. Alexander Burns, Travels into Bokhara, Volume 1, 1834. Burns's reception in Peshawar by Sultan Muhammad Khan stands as one of the finest ethnographic set pieces in the literature of the frontier. The Barakzai Sardar, handsome, sociable, intellectually curious, and burdened by a political situation of almost impossible complexity, met his guests personally, emptied his seraglio for their accommodation, and fed them on pilaus and roasted lamb and sherbet chilled with snow brought down from the Safeco. Burns was alert to the political dimensions of this hospitality. Sultan Muhammad was paying tribute in horses and rice to the Sikhs, was at odds with his more capable brother, Dost Muhammad Khan, in Kabul, and was managing a court full of competing Sardars, each with their own alliances and grievances. The hospitality was genuine, in the sense that Melmastia is always genuine among Pashtuns. It was also, inevitably, strategic. A British officer travelling toward Kabul was an asset whose goodwill was worth cultivating. What impresses the modern reader of this account is not the exoticism of the scene, the hawk on the Sardar's wrist, the precocious sons showing off their Arabic and Persian, the Tuesday gatherings for quail fighting, but its ordinariness. Burns was witnessing a world that had been functioning in its essential forms for several centuries, and that would continue to function in modified but recognisable forms for another century and a half. The Sardari system, in which power rested with hereditary tribal leaders who derived authority from a combination of military capacity, lineage, and the management of hospitality and obligation, was not abolished by British rule so much as it was absorbed into it. The Sardars became the intermediaries through whom the colonial state administered the frontier. Their hujras became the sites where British political agents negotiated. Their sons were educated at Chiefs College in Lahore and recruited into the Indian Army. The British, as Caroe understood, did not so much transform the frontier as they added themselves to it. Contemporary Peshawar capital of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, a city of perhaps 4 million people, including the vast wave of Afghan refugees absorbed after 1979 and the internal displacement driven by TTP insurgency after 2001, is superficially unrecognisable from the city Burns described. The great bazaars of Kissaquani, Storytellers Street, and Andashahar are now dense with motorcycles and mobile phone shops. The Mughal-era city wall has largely disappeared. The British cantonment to the south, with its broad avenues and regimental messes, is now a Pakistani military zone. Islamia College, the institution founded in 1913 that educated generations of Pashtun intellectuals and political leaders, still stands in its Mughal Gothic buildings. Edwards College, named after the British administrator Herbert Edwards, whose influence on the frontier in the 1840s and 1850s was considerable, continues to function. These institutions are not merely buildings. They are the fossilized record of a particular theory of how the frontier could be managed through education, through the cultivation of a Pashtun elite that was both locally rooted and imperially legible. What has not changed is the texture of hospitality. The Hudra survives, in urban Peshawar, as a social institution, even where the physical structure has been replaced by a drawing room or a hotel lobby. The obligation to feed the guest, to make him comfortable, to engage him in the conversation that constitutes political life. This remains embedded in Pashtun social practice in ways that resist administrative transformation. Burns would have recognised the form of his reception in the households of contemporary Peshawar, even if the pilaus are now accompanied by Coca-Cola rather than snow-cooled sherbet. What has changed profoundly is the religious atmosphere. Burns's account of Peshawar under Sultan Muhammad Khan describes a court whose Islam was eclectic, Sufi-inflected, tolerant of European visitors and their curiosities. The Sardars venerated peers and mullahs certainly, but their piety was embedded in a social world that included quail fighting, poetry recitation, and the frank enjoyment of hospitality extended to non-Muslims. The Deobandi movement, founded at Darul Uloom Deoband in 1866–67 as a reformist response to the disaster of 1857, and the growing assertiveness of Christian missionary activity, had not yet reached the frontier in any organised form. Its subsequent expansion through the madrasa networks of the frontier, accelerating enormously under Zia-ul-Haq's Islamization program in the 1980s, and the Pakistani state's strategic use of religious militancy during the Afghan jihad, transformed the religious landscape in ways that Caroe already sensed were coming, and that have since reshaped the frontier irreversibly. The Taliban, in both their Afghan and Pakistani iterations, are inconceivable without this history. So is the partial erosion of the Sufi and customary Pashtunwali-centred Islam that Burns encountered. 4. Gandhara, layers of antiquity in the Peshawar Valley. Burns noted, en route from Peshawar toward Kabul, a decayed tope, a Buddhist stupa, and remarked on others reported in the Khyber Hills and towards Swat and Buna. His curiosity was genuine but constrained. He deferred to Elphinstone's earlier account, noting that he would avoid duplication. What Burns was observing, without yet having the full archaeological vocabulary to describe it, were the remnants of Gandhara, the civilization that flourished in the Peshawar Valley and its surrounding hills from roughly the 3rd century BCE through the 7th century CE at the intersection of Hellenistic, Persian, Indian, and Central Asian cultural currents. The Peshawar Valley contains, beneath its surface and occasionally above it, the accumulated evidence of a history that dwarfs the Sikh-Afghan conflicts Burns had been sent to observe. The Kanishka Stupa at Shahji-Kideri, one of the largest Buddhist monuments ever constructed, stood near Peshawar until its excavation in the early 20th century revealed the reliquary casket containing the Buddha's relics. Takhti Bahi, the great monastic complex on a hilltop an hour's drive from Peshawar near Mardan. now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, was already ancient when Alexander of Macedon passed through the region in 327 BCE. The Greeks left their mark on the sculpture of Gandhara. The serene, idealized physiognomy of Gandharan Buddhas owes something to Hellenistic conventions of representing the divine in human form, producing one of history's most remarkable instances of cultural synthesis. Burns was aware of this depth, even if he could not fully chart it. The stupa he described was already a ruin when he saw it. The villages around it had incorporated its stones into their walls, as villages across the subcontinent habitually repurpose monumental remains. The archaeological enterprise that would later excavate and classify the Gandharan world was still decades away. But his instinct that this landscape contained more than its present inhabitants and their current conflicts was sound. The Peshawar Valley is a palimpsest in the most literal sense, a surface written upon, erased, and rewritten so many times that every layer is simultaneously present and partially obscured. Heritage preservation in contemporary Khyber Pakhtunkhwa remains a complex and imperfectly resolved project. The Swat Museum, whose remarkable collection of Gandharan sculpture was damaged during the TTP's occupation of Swat in 2007-09, has been restored with international assistance. Takhti Bahi receives scholars and tourists, though the security situation of the mid-2000s reduced visitor numbers dramatically. The broader challenge is that Gandhara is not, for most Pakistani Pashtuns, a straightforward source of national or ethnic pride. Its Buddhism sits awkwardly within an Islamic framework of historical self-understanding, and the political uses of pre-Islamic history remain contested. What Burns encountered as a curiosity of the roadside has become, in the 21st century, a site of genuine historiographical and political complexity. 5. From enemies to neighbours. Sikhs in the Pashtun lands. The most unexpected continuity that Burns's account illuminates, when read against the present, concerns the Sikh community of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. Burns operated in a landscape defined by Sikh military dominance and Afghan resentment of it. The tributes extracted by Ranjit Singh's horses, rice, the humiliation of submission were a source of constant anger among the Sardars Burns met. And yet a small but tenacious Sikh community remained in the frontier region after partition in 1947 and has, against all odds, survived there into the present. These are, in many cases, Pashto-speaking Sikhs communities that trace their roots to the Sikh presence in the Peshawar Valley over the 18th and 19th centuries, but that did not leave during the violence of partition, protected in some instances by Pashtun neighbours who honoured the obligations of proximity and shared livelihood. They are merchants, principally cloth dealers, pharmacists, jewellers, and their integration into the social fabric of Peshawar bazaar life is such that their religious difference has been, for long periods, unremarkable. They observe Pashtunwali alongside their Sikh practice, in a fusion that would have struck Burns as improbable, but that reflects the frontier's long history of producing hybrid identities. This community has been under severe pressure since 2001. The rise of the TTP and the general deterioration of security in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa has driven significant emigration to Punjab, to Nankana Sahib, to India, to the Sikh diaspora in Canada and the United Kingdom. Targeted killings, of which there have been several in Peshawar in the past 2 decades, have accelerated this process. Where Burns witnessed open enmity between Sikh and Pashtun, the late 20th century had produced a quiet coexistence. Where that coexistence had produced something approaching integration, the violence of the post-9/11 decade has introduced new pressures. The reconciliation is real. Its durability is not guaranteed. What strikes the observer, familiar with both Burns's account and the contemporary situation, is the degree to which the Sikh community of Peshawar represents, in miniature, the larger story of the frontier. The layering of identities, the unexpected survivals, the way in which political violence and administrative transformation repeatedly fail to erase what has been embedded in daily social practice over generations. Burns's world of sharp and violent enmity has yielded, through colonial administration, partition, Pakistani statehood, and the pressures of insurgency, to something considerably more ambiguous and considerably more human. 6. Broader transformations: infrastructure, identity, and the long frontier. The physical transformation of the corridor from Attock to Peshawar since Burns's passage is, in purely material terms, total. The road Burns travelled on horseback is now a national highway carrying container trucks between Karachi and the Khyber Pass. The river crossing he negotiated by boat is spanned by a cantilever bridge. The garrison towns are serviced by railway lines. The villages are connected by electricity and mobile networks to global information systems. Peshawar has a university, several hospitals, an international airport. The infrastructure of modernity is present, if unevenly distributed. What is more interesting and more instructive is what has not changed. The FATA merger of 2018, the formal incorporation of the federally administered tribal areas into Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, was, in administrative terms, the final step in a process that the British began with the extension of political agency control over the frontier in the 1890s. The progressive absorption of the tribal belt into the structures of the state. And yet, the merger has not dissolved tribal identity, or the authority of the jirga as a mechanism of dispute resolution, or the practical dominance of lineage-based politics in the former tribal districts. The state has extended its nominal reach. The social structures that predate the state have accommodated themselves to it without disappearing. 7. Conclusion. The palimpsest and its readers. Alexander Burns found security as eggs under a hen among the Khattaks, a phrase that has the quality of a Pashtun proverb, and may indeed have been one, borrowed and translated by a man with an instinct for the telling detail. It captures something that the romance of the frontier in Kipling, in Caroe, in Mayne, in the tradition to which this essay belongs, consistently returns to: the paradox of a landscape associated with violence and instability that nevertheless generates, through Melmastia and Nanawati, extraordinary conditions of security for those it takes under its protection. The palimpsest metaphor is useful but requires care. A palimpsest implies that earlier layers are obscured by later ones partially visible, requiring special light to read. The Peshawar Valley is not quite like this. It is a landscape in which multiple layers are simultaneously and aggressively present. Gandharan stonework reused in mosque foundations, Mughal gateways surviving in the midst of Pakistani bazaars, British cantonment bungalows housing Pakistani military families, Sikh havalis converted into Pashtun family compounds. The past is not buried here. It is repurposed, which is a more dynamic relationship with history than simple preservation or simple erasure would suggest. Burns read this landscape with the eye of a man who understood that the intelligence he was gathering would serve imperial purposes, but who could not entirely prevent himself from being genuinely interested in the people who were providing it. His account of Sultan Muhammad Khan is more sympathetic than his official dispatches required. His descriptions of hospitality are more detailed than strategic necessity demanded. He was, in some sense, already writing for the tradition that Caroe and Mayne and Kipling would inhabit the tradition in which the Pashtun frontier is understood to make demands on its witnesses that mere observation cannot satisfy. To write about this region from within, as someone for whom the N5 highway between Rawalpindi and Peshawar is not an itinerary in a travel account, but a road traversed in ordinary life, is to understand that the romance and the reality are not opposites. The romance is a way of paying attention to something that rewards attention. the persistence of social forms across political transformations, the survival of obligations across historical discontinuities, the presence of the past in the texture of the everyday. Burns felt it in 1832, crossing the Indus at Attock with a Khattak escort, and the sound of two different greetings, one Sikh, one Afghan, exchanged across a politically charged silence. Nearly 2 centuries later, that crossing still asks something of those who make it.